Good evening, and welcome to Socrates Garrett Live. We're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi. You know, Mississippi is a great place to raise your family. It's a great place to go fishing and hunting and do all of those things, but we don't have an economy. And tonight we're going to talk about the economy just a little bit. You see, commerce came before government. Actually, businesses created the government. Now, you might ask, why am I saying that? Because businesses needed a way to collect funds from everyday citizens, and they didn't have a mechanism to do that. So we created government so that it could tax the people, and that we could pool those dollars, and then we could distribute those dollars to our businesses. And that's how it has always worked, and that's the way it always will work. Now, if you're watching us on YouTube, we want you to subscribe to the program, hit the notifications button so that you will get shows like this that don't often come on the network. If you're watching us on Facebook, then send us the stars, subscribe to the program, share it with your friends and family, hit the notifications button. It's important that we build our base so that we can get our message out. Now, we're tracking a lot of things from right here in Jackson, Mississippi. Most of it has to do with who controls the economy. Now, the economy just doesn't happen, as Jim Evans likes to say over on Straight Talk on Sunday afternoons. You know, you have to make it work for you. And that's why we have government. The economy. What does the economy mean? It means that those dollars that you're investing in your government are being utilized and returned back to the citizens that sent you there in the first place. So we got to create a business. Now, businesses are hard to create and even harder to sustain, but it's our only hope. When we say that no one's coming to save us, it means that we have to take matters in our own hands, control our own destiny, and build an economy that works for us. Now, I started in business as a little boy, really. I recall that at 5, 6 years old, my father had a lumber business. So we would go into the woods and cut wood and pulpwood and logs all day. And my grandfather, Eugene Garrett, introduced into Farm Haven, Mississippi, a sawmill ordered out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. So we were able to go into the woods, harvest timber, come back to our mill, saw the lumber up, and then build houses. And so I saw that happening at 6 years old. And so I saw all of the terrible things that went along with that. In that, when a white person wanted to buy some lumber from you, you would have to say, yes, sir, and no, sir. And they would often determine the price that they were going to pay for the lumber more than you setting the price. They would tell you what they were going to pay. And I used to question my father and my uncle. And when they would say, yes, sir, and no, sir, and I didn't like that. And my uncle would say to me, he said he knew that I was struggling with it. So he said to me that every time I said, yes, sir, that lumber went up 50 cents a foot. I said, okay, all right. Then that at least you have a plan. At least you in ways that you can, you're making that conversation as demeaning as it was, you're making some profitability on the backside of that transaction. And that was the only way that he could fight back. And so, you know, many times we would be working at the sawmill and folk would stop by and talk with us and want to see how did it run, how does it operate, how did you get the diesel engine to start with the big old belts running around the diesel engine, the shaft on the diesel engine, and pulling the carriage along with the lumber, rolling that log up there with can hooks. Many of you never heard of the term can hook, but it was what we used to roll logs onto the carriage. And my uncle and my father would take that lumber and they would turn that log until they would take all of the skin or the bark off of it, and then they would begin to cut one before us, two before us, by turning that log and position it based upon the size of the lumber that they were cutting. So they could take that log and they could cut one before us, two before us, two by tens. They could do whatever they wanted to do with the log. Now, the hardest job in the world was the guy that was, we called tilling the sawmill, when he had to catch all of the lumber that was coming off of the carriage and stack it somewhere. My job as a 6-year-old boy was to dig the sawdust from around the belt, the belts that were carrying the sawdust to a great big sawdust pile. And we could never let the pulley get bogged down in the sawdust. So we had to continuously dig the sawdust out so that the pulley could run freely. Then we would have to take the lumber and run it through what we call a planer. And this was to smooth it out and make absolutely certain that it didn't have any rough edges on it, so that you would have boards now that were intended to be used in building structures, homes and churches and things of that nature. Now, I say that because if you were building a barn, you may not need to run the lumber through a planer. You just use rough lumber to do that. But it was hard to get a nail to go through that oak lumber. I mean, it really was very, very difficult to get that done. So here we are. We go to the woods, we cut the logs down, we transport the logs to the sawmill, we put the logs on the carriage, we cut the lumber, we stacked the lumber over there, and then we took the lumber and we built churches and houses. Now, this was all going on in 1900. You see, so we had an economy. This is what the point I'm trying to make is that we were controlling the economy. And that's what our ancestors and our forefathers had to do. They control the economy, whether it was in lumber or whether it was in gardens or whether it was in cane and sugar and syrup. They control the economy. You see, we didn't buy anything from anyone except some flour and on occasion some salt. The basic part of the salt was to make certain that we gave it to the cows, the cattle, And so we bought that on occasions. Other than that, we were completely self-sufficient. Now, this little lesson, this little conversation that we're having is designed to say that our forefathers and our parents knew that they had to control the economy. Now, they didn't have a great challenge controlling the economy other than, someone on occasion maybe would steal a watermelon. Maybe you wake up one morning and you were missing, two sheep or two goats or a cow, but not often, because back then we didn't even close our doors. We closed the doors, but we never locked the doors because we just didn't have that kind of environment. Growing up as in that environment, I was I was a freshman or sophomore in college before I ever saw or heard of marijuana. Just did not have that to deal with growing up. And so I think about how fortunate we were, as difficult as we had it. We as children didn't have to deal with the issues that our children are dealing with today. There were no diseases that would kill you. I mean, you could go to the doctor and be rid of whatever your ailment was. There were no life-threatening diseases. I mean, the only life-threatening disease that we had at the time, we didn't really call it a disease. We called it sugar. Today they call it diabetes, but back then we just called it sugar. We knew that sugar was the problem. And so you'd see people that would lose a limb or lose a foot or something of that nature, dealing with that horrific disease. Today, you can balance yourself with medication and diet and exercise and do fairly well. But back then, we had some sweet tea, the sweetest tea you ever dreamed of in your life. And it was very harmful, but they didn't know it. So there was no such thing as unsweet tea. I never heard of that in my life. First time I heard of unsweet tea, I thought it was sinful, and to even ask someone to drink that. And so, but I want to talk about the economy. And so we bring ourselves to the point that in order to build our communities, we have to control the economy. Now, unfortunately, our parents thought that we were smarter than them because we got more book education. My father only went to the 8th grade, but he was the smartest man that I knew. He could walk up to a tree and tell you how many square feet of lumber was in that tree. He could tell you exactly what the weight was on a load of logs going down the highway. He could do all that. My mother was teaching school, but he could grade the papers because his math was better than hers. He could calculate things in his head. And so, but they thought we would be smarter because we got to go to the 12th grade. Now, many of us didn't get to go to the 12th grade because we had to drop out of school to work on the farm. So I think of this month being March, and I think how we would be getting ready now to break the ground because we know we were going to plant corn on April the 15th. We see April 14th and April 15th now is a day that we got to deal with Uncle Sam and the IRS and taxes. But when I was coming up as a boy, April 14th, April 15th was the day that we were going to be planting corn. And that's when the season began. We would be planting and working in the fields from April all the way through the end of October, a little bit into November. That was our season. So we certainly didn't get to go to school much in April and May, and then certainly didn't go at all June, July, August, September. We might get back to school sometime in the latter part of October, and try to catch up on our education. You know, these lessons are critically important that we understand and that we share these with our children. You see, farming was the economy. This is how we fed ourselves. This is how we clothed ourselves. This is how we bought gasoline, how we got fuel through farming. There were no industries and smokestacks in the country. You never seen that. So, but everybody owned a lot of land. You know, I wonder sometimes how blacks acquired so much land, but they had 500-600 acres of land. Wasn't unusual at all. And so you could take care of yourself. You could feed yourself. And we're getting ready to go to a commercial break. And after that, we're going to come back and continue this conversation. Stay tuned.
Garrett Wholesale Tires and Trucking Company. We hit the ground running and leave the rest behind. Get moving with Garrett today. At Garrett Tire and Truck Company, we carry the top tire brands in the industry. Truck tires, commercial tires, passenger tires, all at wholesale prices. Whether you run one vehicle or an entire fleet, we keep you rolling longer with durability, performance, and unbeatable value. Why pay retail when you can buy wholesale? Garrett Wholesale Tires and Trucking Company. Top brands, wholesale prices, built for the road.
We're back. If you're watching us on YouTube, then share this program with your friends and family. Subscribe, hit the notifications button. You're watching it on Facebook, send us stars, subscribe, share this program with your friends and families. Hit the notification button. It's tremendously important that you support us, that we'll continue to be able to bring you these kinds of programs. Now, we were talking about the economy. We were talking about how important it is, and we're talking a little bit about how our parents were able to create an economy that took care of them. There were no subsidies. You know, there was no aid, there was no welfare, there was no SNAP, there was no WIC, there was none of these things. All we had was the land. And we worked the land, and we took care of ourselves, took care of our families. And then we sent our children, I'm being one of the children, we sent our children to the best schools we could get them in. You know, my uncle, Robert Garrett, was driving a school bus in Madison County. And well, first of all, the way we got a school bus is because we built it. they didn't send us a school bus for black children to go to school. We built the school bus by hand. And my Uncle Robert was driving this homemade school bus with black children on it. And, as a young man, we like speed. And so he passed a school bus that was loaded with white kids. And the bus driver got very upset with him. And so they stopped my Uncle Robert, opened the door of the bus, and with a 12-gauge shotgun, shot him in the face. He threw his hands up in front of his face, and he shot his thumb off and shot out one of his eyes, just because he dared to pass a school bus that had white kids on it. And so it was some difficult times there. But that same uncle attended Tuskegee, became a chef, and prepared the food for Booker T. Washington. It's an amazing story. And so he shared with me that, you see, black men back then were different. They didn't tell you to do something but one time. They didn't argue, they didn't debate, they didn't fuss. They told you one time. And they call you boy. And they didn't, I had 3 brothers. My daddy would walk in the room and said, boy, go do this. And he knew exactly which boy he was talking about without him calling anybody by their name. And so my uncle was down at Tuskegee as a chef going to school, and he said that he would have to take Booker T. Washington his lunch, and the lunch, his plate, would have to arrive at his desk exactly at 12 o'clock. He said if they were 5 minutes late bringing his plate, he would not accept it. Think about that for a moment. We're late. It's just a matter of routine now. We call it colored people's time. Sometimes we make fun and jokes about it. I was joking with a friend not long ago, and he said, blacks started a new airlines, and they were trying to get a name for the airlines, and he said one of them suggested that we name it We Leave Late. That's a bit of irony in that, but my point was that Booker T's food had to be on his desk exactly at 12 o'clock. And so my uncle went on to become a chef and moved, never came back to Mississippi. I wouldn't blame him. Went on to Chicago and had a distinguished career as a chef in Chicago, Illinois. And there are lots of stories like that we're going to have to share as we go along. I don't prepare anything before my podcast. My life experiences tell me where I have been, and I share them as they come to mind. Now, maybe I should prepare some things, but we'll see how we go. So that's how we get back to the fact that we have the discipline and we have to control the economy. At all costs, you got to do that. Now, something happened. You see, our parents thought that we should get an education, and they fought hard against separate but equal, which was the law of the land. They fought hard against that, and I understand why, because, when I was going to Velma Jackson High School, I realized that our gymnasium was one that they put together from an old barn. And I realized that all of the books were hand-me-down books with white kids' names in the books before we got them. And so I understood that they were fighting for us to have equal representation in education. But we were getting a good education, even with the secondhand books, even with the wood buildings, even with no air conditioning in the buildings. And my mother once said that air conditioning is not a good thing in school because now we're getting too comfortable and we want to go to sleep. And so her point was that we got to stay focused. And so if we stayed focused, then we were getting a good education. But they thought we should embrace integration. And so we fought for that. And a good friend of mine that's integrated Ole Miss, James Meredith, is coming up on his 60th year anniversary of the March of Freedom, where James Meredith was gunned down trying to show Black people that they didn't have to be afraid. And they had a right to be afraid. They had a right to be afraid. There was tremendous violence. I can't share with you enough the difficulties that a Black man had trying to be the head of his household and be the man in his community when a white woman walks down the street and he's got to get off of the sidewalk and let her by with all his kids. Can you imagine with you all of your kids and walking down the sidewalk? A white woman's approaching. You got to grab all your kids and get off the sidewalk. But then you want to tell everybody that you're a man. It's very difficult to get that done. But they did what they had to do to protect their children, and they thought that if we could get integrated, that the children would do better. And so they fought hard for that. And so we eventually saw some movement and schools became integrated. A very difficult thing happened after that. We lost control over our economy. We now had our children being taught by people that did not look like them, did not value their story, did not understand their struggle, teaching them every day how to be more like them than how to be more like their natural selves. And so we began to lose our identity, and we, most importantly, we lost our economy. And so when a man or woman does not have the ability to take care of themselves, to provide for themselves, they lose their self-esteem and they lose something that's so basically fundamental to manhood and womanhood, the ability to provide for your family. And so we've been struggling ever since that to try to figure out how to reacquire an economy. Now, we all know the stories about, Black Wall Street. And once after Reconstruction, we understand that everybody understands that if we allow people to have an economy, then they won't be subservient. You see, you become subservient when you're dependent upon someone else for your survival. And we see much of that going on today. We're going to get into some of that as what's going on in the world, the struggles to control the economy, to feed themselves as it grows rampant in Africa. Same struggle that we see going on in Ghana, in Burkina Faso. The same struggle that we see, the same struggle in Jackson, Mississippi, and in other cities and southern states. The same struggle is, how do you control your own economy? How do you make absolutely certain that you can provide for your family? And there are a lot of forces out here that understand the lack of the economy is what keeps a person enslaved. Not the law of the land, but the inability to provide for yourself will make you become enslaved. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a black person to a white person, but you'll become enslaved from a black person to a black person. But you will become enslaved. And so it's all about the economy. Now, when I say the same things going on in Jackson and other southern cities, because when I look at the economy in Jackson, a city that's got 90% black population, but gets less than 10% of contracts for goods and services to that population, that is crazy. That is subservient. That means you don't have an economy. When I look at the state of Mississippi, that's got 40% of its population being of African American descent, but gets less than 1% of the contracts for goods and services to that population, that is crazy. That is beyond belief. You would have been better off to have 100% of the economy back on the farm than less than 1% of the economy with your education. Something doesn't add up here. Something's rotten in Denmark, as they say. And this is happening all over the South. Well, I said it was happening in Africa as well, because in Africa, they produce their goods and services, they export, and then they buy finished products from their goods and services right back into the continent at a higher price than they sold it for originally. And this is the law of the land. And so the continent will remain poor, destitute, because it doesn't have an economy that is controlling. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some other things as we go along. But before I close this evening, I want to say that in 1946, the beginning of the baby boomers. And this generation brought in more children than any other generation. We were not the greatest generation. That was the generation of 1910 and 1920, something like that. But 1946 brought in the baby boomers. And so we all came in here together. Now, what happens when you all come together at the same time? It means that we're all going to leave around the same time. And so we begin to see now the demise of the baby boomers. That population is dying at a rapid rate. This week alone in Jackson, Mississippi, we lost 2 prominent citizens. Dr. Elaine Hayes Anthony, the interim president of Jackson State University, a pillar in the community, a stand-up lady. We lost her. On the same day, we lost Dr. Alice Smith, the mother of the late District Attorney Robert Smith, from a distinguished family of educators. Her brother was my close friend, Esther Smith, vice president at Jackson State University. But we lost them on the same day. And so we're going to continue to see the boomers boom out. We came in, now we'll came in together, now we'll leave out together. And so it puts a tremendous strain now on care for the elderly. It puts a tremendous strain on families now to make sure that they can take care of their loved ones. But you cannot take care of them if you don't participate in the economy. You cannot do it. So the economy is everything. Next time, we're going to talk about starting a business, participating in the economy. The only reason you start a business is to get actively involved in the economy. And you want to get involved in the economy so that you can feed your family. You can take care of Maslow's hierarchy of need, food, shelter first. Then we'll get to self-actualization and other stuff. But you gotta be able to provide food and shelter and medical care at a bare minimum to your family. And you can only do that if you participate in the economy. In Jackson, in the southern states, in Africa, Blacks are not participating in the economy. Something has to change. Y'all stay safe. Until the next time, good evening.